Welcome to this audio-video interview, which is realized in the framework of the European project entitled after Intercultural Competencies for Adult Educators with the acronym INCrEAsE. The project is funded by the European Commission in the framework of the Erasmus Plus program, Strategic Partnership for Adult Education. And the project aims to develop intercultural communication of adult educators working in formal and non-formal educational settings in order to help them to overcome the challenges arising from their everyday work with multicultural and multilingual learners population. So the focus of the project is addressed to adult educators. So one of them accepted my invitation to be the sacrificial victim of this interview. This adult educator is Alan Bruce. First of all, I would like to thank him for this availability, and I will immediately leave the floor to Alan to present himself, in particular to underline his role and his activities as adult educator dealing with multicultural learners. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for the invitation. When I first heard about the project and I heard about what was involved, I was more than interested. Many of the aspects of this, I think, parallel my own interests and my own experience over the years. Maybe before I say what I do now, I will give you some background, which I hope is useful. Multiculturalism runs through my DNA, in the sense that I am Irish, but I was born and brought up outside Ireland, both in Canada as a young child and then later on in the United States, primarily in California. And I grew up with an acute awareness of civil rights, the struggle around difference, and also my growing awareness, I'll be quite frank with you, of the pernicious racism in United States society. So I came to a certain point. When I was 19, I decided I needed to leave. And I left by going back to where my parents came from, thinking I knew a lot about Ireland and Irish culture. And I ended up quite surprised when I arrived, of course, because I hadn't grown up there. So I was in this curious position, which has continued through my life, of thinking I was one thing, but really discovering I was something else. And this led into an exploration of Irish identity, which informed my academic studies. By background, I completed my undergraduate studies in Galway in the west of Ireland, which was a bilingual university in English and in the Irish language. And that was my first exposure to bilingualism and to the power and the beauty of the Irish language. But it also, I was living in, at the time, one of the most underdeveloped regions of Europe, ranking with the south of Italy or the south of Spain, extraordinary histories of poverty and exclusion and emigration. And my academic interest mirrored that because my focus was on colonialism and the way one culture replaces another and the process involved, both in terms of obviously the politics, the history and the economics, but also the psychology. Later on in my master's, I took this further. My supervisor for this was Johan Galtung, who set up the Oslo Peace Institute. So and I did this in Amsterdam, and living in the Netherlands, I became aware of other dimensions of interculturalism and tolerance and acceptance. And this led down to another. I worked later on in France and then with the European Commission. And as I went through all these different environments, I kept being aware, who am I? What is my identity or my family or my culture? And I was many things, as indeed everybody around me. And I think this continued. After my doctoral studies, I specialized in colonialism, the impact of light industry. I carried this on using examples of Ireland and the southwest of France. But I changed course. 10 years after all this, wanted to go back to Ireland again. This time older, maybe more mature, thinking I could cope. And when I came back, the academic job I wanted did not become available, but I had applied for another job which I forgot about, and it was working with disability, a research project with young people, with students with disabilities being integrated into mainstream schools. And we're talking about the 1980s, and I knew a lot at this stage about many categories of difference, but disability I had not really considered. I said I would do this for 1 year and then go back to my real life, and I ended up spending 17 years. working with a government agency, and they ended up as head of policy and standards and development, and looking at how do we train our staff around understanding the difference around disability. So that was for many years, until 20 years ago, when, again, for other reasons, I decided to go on my own. And I've been independent since, and working, designing courses, designing training, evaluating courses around difference. So I designed and wrote, we had to do this because we had over, at one stage, 10,000 people working in the disability sector in Ireland, but there were no staff training programs. So there were no programs about disability, for example, which meant that, well, what was the history of disability? And in Ireland, this is a highly contentious subject because it's connected with abuse and institutionalization and silence and invisibility. And as I had to write courses, I had to do more and more. So we had teams working on this. And also at this time, in the 1990s, Ireland, for the first time, instead of exporting people, had people coming in. And for the first time, I remember most immigrants were met with the phrase, "Why did you come here?" And it's exactly what had greeted me when I had arrived in the 1970s. Why did you leave California to come to this place? And I have therefore seen these intercultural differences from the inside and from the outside. Now, this has continued. Rather than going through what I did in the past, having to write courses meant we had to link disability, and this is my key point, Antonio, instead of to the mainstream, our idea of what is the normal healthy person, but to other categories of difference and discrimination. So we began to link disability to things like racism, to things like homophobia, to things like gender issues. And as we did that, we developed a lot of alternative linkages. So this is the pattern I've been involved in since we became independent, looking at courses, running programs at European level, still at Irish level, and I'm still very much involved in this, broadening it out to looking at human difference in a very broad sense of the word, and educating the people who have to do the same. So I hope that gives you a sense, an overview.
Absolutely. When I read the project application, so about multiculturalism and providing educators with the skill to, to manage multicultural classes, I said, really in 2020, we still need to provide adult educators with the skills to manage with something which should be nature, which should be part of our life and our reality. And then the recent news and what happened, for example, in the US and the Black Lives Matter movement and so on, I said, okay, maybe we still need to face this, to discuss about this, and to adapt and to get used with the idea of a multicultural reality in which everybody is involved in. You already replied to the second question because you said that these issues are already part of your DNA. But anyway, intercultural communication was already part of your nature. On the other hand, how education contributed to develop this kind of skills? Did you receive something in terms of skills, competencies in dealing with multicultural education, thanks to your educational background and your educational path?
Yeah, I think that's the question I'll answer in two ways. The first thing is, yes, there's a process of study. I think since I started my as a student in California, right through in the different places, there was a question of rigorous analysis. And I think pulling apart definitions or assumptions, I don't like to take things at face value. I like to probe it a bit more. And the second thing is the use of narrative or story, because I think this is a critical way we convey information. And the mythologies we all have are mythologies about the journey, Odysseus, or the discovery of oneself, but also of others. And I think in the European context, that becomes particularly, shall we say, full of meaning, and the meaning for many others. So there were many writers and many people who had struggled with issues of identity and multicultural acceptance, and sometimes in very contentious circumstances, like Frantz Fanon in Algeria, who saw himself initially as simply a French doctor, but then later on sees that he's from Martinique and he's also Black and he is also oppressed and he identifies with the oppressed. A big influence, he just died recently, was Albert Memmi, who is Tunisian, but Jewish, and left between, am I part of the Tunisian nationalist movement or am I part of the French colons? What am I? And this question of identity, I think, runs through it. So I think for me, it was shaped by many writers, many issues. In Ireland, this was always the identity of victimhood, rather than looking at the complexity of Irish history, where Irish people could be oppressors. There are certain themes that run through, I think, the European experience that really take you to another level that we don't always explore. So for me, if I may digress, in teaching was not starting about talking about the other, but starting about talking about who are we. So one of my great tricks with my groups of educators is to start off by saying, for example, if we're in Ireland, define Irishness. People are very quick to define what they think is African or Italian, or we have a whole series of cliches we can pull out of our Walt Disney box. But when you ask people to define themselves, two things happen. First of all, they don't know. They just assume, sure, we all know what it means. And I said, do we? Tell me, I don't know. And I can play that role. And this is very good. And I've used this in other contexts. If I can finish this part maybe with just one quick story. I work in many different countries, and one country where I work most is Finland. And on my first trip to Finland, I was asked by the Director of Social Services in Tuusula, which is north of Helsinki, to run a seminar on interculturalism. Finland had just had maybe 6 immigrants, and the country was in crisis. What do we do about this? Nobody, if Ireland was bad, nobody wanted to come to Finland, and the language is impossible, the weather's terrible. But that was a coded message for please stay away. But to do this, I had 300 people in, and I gave a talk about this and some of the aspects. And to my surprise, because I like to connect with my students, at the end of this, everybody was sitting completely expressionless and silent. There was polite applause, and I was thinking, I've thrown everything into this about difference, about oppression, about transformation, about how multicultural headsets. This is not resonating with people. And when this ended, we had 300 officials from all around this part of Finland. People were coming up and saying, I was deeply touched. Thank you so much for what you said. And I said to my colleague, I said, but everybody sat there expressionless. And she said, that's our way. We don't express feelings. Where in Ireland, they would either kill you or they would be cheering. It was just different, not just the subject, but the audience. And this is not to condemn it. And she said to me, in future, when you speak with a Finnish group, look at their eyes. The eyes will show feeling, will show emotion. And I think with each culture, and this is slightly superficial, we can look at different ways we have to greet, to meet, to understand, to develop empathy. I've noticed in Italy, people would tend to shake hands or use physical touch a lot, be very expressive, as I found in Ireland. Other countries have, this doesn't happen. Or it happens the first time you meet somebody and never, never again. And all these things are small, but very important in terms of intercultural competence and training. I have done many, many programs, either as a student or as a contributor, around intercultural training for the Irish Management Institute. These are for business people going abroad, avoiding basic mistakes in terms of, obviously, in Muslim countries, which hand do you eat with, how do you greet, little small things that make all the difference. But the small things indicate an attention to detail that I think educators need to have in being sensitive to the audience. So I hope that covers the things you were looking for.
Absolutely. And I confirm you like to connect with your students, because I have several examples about that. Anyway, so as it seems that we still have to do a lot within multiculturalism, according to the recent events, I would need your definition about intercultural communication, in particular, which are, in your opinion, the key words connected to intercultural communication. I just wrote down some of the words you already mentioned. You have been speaking about tolerance. You have been speaking about identity, empathy. What are the other keywords which fall into the definition of intercultural communication?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, maybe the first thing is, let's go back to what I discovered in an ad hoc way. The first thing is start the journey by looking at yourself. What is my culture? What are the things? And we tend to just assume. I think the first thing we need to do is deconstruct assumptions. And we do this best if we start with ourselves, okay? Are we really what we think we are? Is it really? And again, if we talk about a story, a narrative, the myths we have, those myths were shaped by the communities that came before us. And in many ways, when we look in new ways, we begin to see things differently. I'll give you another example. I was going through a small town when my daughters were very young in the south of Ireland, a place called Clonmel. Interesting in history in its own way. And in the 1950s, long before my time, I didn't know anything about Ireland, but Ireland was dominated by the Roman Catholic Church, by a very pietistic, controlling culture of religious oppression. And it was quite interesting. They would set up statues to Mary all over the place. I'm actually from a Protestant background, so I found this bizarre on a number of levels. But what was interesting, but in one place they had a phrase, the family that prays together stays together. I don't know if you have this in Italy. It's a famous cliche. And the idea was, it was about the prayer for Mary, the rosary. And the idea was that every night the family would sit down and say, and the family that prays together stays together. What everybody thought this meant was about no divorce. By the way, divorce was illegal. Everything was illegal. But the idea, I looked immediately and I said, but people were praying all the time, but everybody was leaving. The families never stay together. For me, it was about immigration. For the people I knew that had grown up in Ireland, it was about divorce and sexual. So that's the first thing that I had colleagues when were quite shocked at my sense of it. How can you say that? Then they began to think. So I think that journey starts here. Other words that come up, listening to others, genuinely listening. Now this brings in language, which is a subset, being sensitive to linguistic nuance, to difference, using language well. And I think this is very important. In Ireland, unlike other colonized countries, our language was largely lost for many, many reasons. It was actually forbidden to use it, but it was oppressed in many ways. And the famine finished it off. But it's not dead yet, far from it. But what was interesting was that people would try to compensate by denying the Irish language and saying, or seeing English as the only one. And later on, it's something to discover you have two languages, or maybe more coming into your background. Second thing is observing. Observe others. Observe what they do. I think observe openly. Don't judge. Don't make assumptions. I think one of the big issues we've had in intercultural training is understanding prejudice and discrimination. And one thing we made clear to all is I do a huge amount of intercultural training with police services. And you can understand, Antonio, that when you do this kind of training with police, you have very different students. And again, we may make assumptions about police, that they're all ignorant, brutal, racist people. They're not, far from it, especially in Europe, where we have a much higher level of training. The United States, yeah. But the thing was that you would begin to try to get people, it's okay to be prejudiced. We all have prejudices. That's not, where it gets difficult is when the prejudice is acted on. But first of all, we have to start not by saying, I have no prejudice. I've heard this so often, I don't have a prejudiced bone in my body. That's not true. And when we understand why we have a prejudice, then we are able to deal with it. And then this is something we try to demystify issues. So intercultural competence is about, maybe I do have prejudice, but I'm open to learn. I'm open to correct. I'm open to modify. And the day we stop modifying or changing is the day we're dead. So I think there are a lot of things within that. I think looking at key points of contact is important. How people meet each other. I mentioned earlier, how people discuss. In Japanese culture, there are things you don't say, and by not saying them, you're saying them. in China very much as well, with the very different ways. The way people eat, the importance of food, these are common things. Music. And I think all these I see as portals into understanding the other. Now, there are people who go on this journey and they become the other. They are so interested in the other culture that they get absorbed into it. And I'm not saying we don't have to do that, but we have to be aware there's difference. Can that difference be turned from a potential threat into a potential resource? And this is my last point where I've been very influenced, has been in a business environment. For many business people, they are practical, they want to do the deal, they want to move on. But you say you could have so much more, you can even make more business out of this by understanding and accepting how people do things. We don't rush things. At the moment, I'm very heavily involved in a major project on language learning and all kinds of things in Palestine. And one thing I've learned from the richness of Palestinian culture, and I think it could apply to Arab culture in general, okay, is this idea if you don't go directly to the point, you take your time, you introduce, you talk, you get to the point, but there's a whole lot of discovery beforehand. So I think whether it's a practical business meeting or it's a day-to-day encounter on the street or it's policing or whatever you do or going to school, it's about looking at those clues about the other, but at the same time looking at clues about ourselves.
Okay, I confess it is the last of 10 interviews I already realized, and you were able to summarize up the inputs I received separately by all the person who were involved in these interviews. And so active listening, attention to details, observation, which is something which is the initial step in order to get used and to meet and to know new people. And those are really, really interesting suggestions for all the adult educators. And moving from this general point of view to something more specific with the last question, in your opinion, which is, in terms of methodological tools or teaching methodologies, the one which works better while dealing with multicultural classes? Which is the tool you prefer while dealing with those kind of audience?
Oh, great. I think this would probably come down to good training, working with people in a way where, first of all, the rules are clear. I think you have to set an environment of confidence and trust that there are no mistakes to be made. There are many mistakes to be made, but there are no stupid questions. You know, there are stupid answers. And I think to let people have the confidence to ask questions which are obvious, but if they don't say it, it gets buried in there. There's a sense, for many people, encountering cultural difference, it can be a question of confusion, of fear, of stereotypes that exist in their head that they didn't know they had. You know, there's a constant question you'll get when somebody goes to somebody else with a different skin color or ethnic type and says, where are you really from? And this has been quite problematic in Ireland, because we now have Irish musicians, and there's one very famous one at the moment, Irish dancers, Irish speakers, whose parents came from Nigeria or came from China. And one of the classic things, this small point, the average African immigrant to Ireland, the average speaks 5 languages. To learn Irish, no problem. You have Irish students who've suffered for the last 90 years since independence, okay, with a forced language learning, where you had to memorize 15th century poetry, and the day your Irish studies were over, that was the end of it. And here's somebody coming in with parents from rural Nigeria speaks better Irish than your grandparents could. Don't make assumptions about people, but I think the clue to this is that it is possible to be many things. And the technique for me, give the trust that people ask questions. I have one colleague, if I can mention his name, Kensika Montwengo, and Kensika is originally from Congo. His father's diplomat. He was brought up between Canada and the Congo, but he ended up in Ireland and, as they say, become more Irish than the Irish. And one day we were running a course together about interculturalism. And one woman, typical Irish Celtic type, mature years, turned around and said, "Can I ask you a question? And don't laugh at me." And he said, "What?" He says, "What does black skin feel like?" And all the rest of the group, you could feel people cringing with embarrassment. And, oh my God, what a stupid question to ask. And he said, "That's a great question." She said, "But I just don't know. It looks so different to me. Does it feel different?" And he says, "Well, you want to touch me and see?" And she was there. He said, then he looked at her with this wonderful smile and said, "You can touch me anywhere you want." And everybody began to laugh. She touched his arm. And she said, "It's just the same." He said, "That's one of the best questions I've had." Because you're probably all thinking that. So let's start at simple things. If that's not a fear, let's look at other things. Why do you play this music so loudly? I'm talking about a lot of stuff I've heard from policing. Why in Nigerian culture do people come to visit you? They don't bring drink, they bring food. So in various police stations in South Dublin, the Nigerians are here because they're bringing food to their police. They've never had this experience of being able to go to a police station and bring food and talk to people as friends. And I think bit by bit, the technique is to, on simple levels, demystify it. Don't make it threatening. Develop contact. There's a listening. And when we do this, you can watch with the group, people are beginning to talk to each other. And they will talk about what is common. And they will talk about things. And this is the beginning, I think. And the other thing is that interculturalism doesn't end when you have a course and a certificate. It starts then. And therefore, the exercises of putting this into play. Many people say, well, in my village, we don't have ethnic Chinese transgendered homosexuals. Maybe you don't, but maybe you do. And when you begin to see things, it's like when you learn a new word for the first time. You've never heard the word before, and in the course of the next 24 hours, you hear it 4 times. Because you never were attuned to looking or listening to that word. And I think in the same way, when we look at difference, we begin to realize there are different dimensions. So I think at a number of levels, what we also try to do in Ireland and in Finland, where this really works, is to ask people to look at how, this is the most effective technique I found, how they have changed. So we have a big program we started doing for the Finnish pharmaceutical sector, pharmacies. I won't go into details, but we found that the staff were complaining because for the first time in their professional careers, in Finland, everybody is very ordered and queues and everything. They had foreign customers, as they call them. Immigrants coming in who come into pharmacies in a very different way, loud, talking, expressive. They don't stand behind the line, they go right to the top, you know? And they're not all from Argentina. So they come in and they're really pushing like this. And the people were shocked. How do we deal with these people? What do we say? What happens when a Muslim man comes up and wants to get medication for his wife? And they're not allowed to do this by law. And then this big thing, and then you say, then you're not allowed to do it by law. You tell him. And so this is not a one-way street, but we had many wonderful experiences. But we started with one by taking archival film of Helsinki in the 1960s, when they would probably remember it, and showing them Helsinki in 1965 and Helsinki today. It is shocking to see the impact it makes. I said, this is us. This is who we were in 65, when 85% of the cars sold in Finland were Moscovich or Lada, where your entire economy was basically a subset of the, and people say, no, it's not true. That's you. Look how you've changed. And if you've changed this way, look how these people have changed. So what we really tried to focus on was the process of change. The change is possible, change is not necessarily threatening, and I think this leads to a lot of good advantages. So I think I have found, in my experience with intercultural training, change is not threatening, change can be beneficial, but change can also be destructive. If we see foreignness as somehow threatening us, I'm not a psychologist, Antonio, that may indicate deeper problems people have. And when people like that find other people like that, it becomes extremely problematic. That's when we get the rise of anti-immigrant groups and racism. But I think the idea is to diffuse it at first, not to say there's a magic solution. If you, I hate to use cliches, but eager young American undergraduate students have their checklist, you know, and people will stop halfway through and say, have I been offending you by any phrase I used? And you don't do that. Be authentic. And that authenticity, I think, if it's in ourselves, we will see it in others, and that starts a dynamic which is positive, where both sides win. And this is my final point. Both sides change, but the change is chosen. So one of the things in Ireland, by the way, we are the only country in Europe that explicitly, as part of our national policy, is about interculturalism. We're not about multicultural or bicultural or that. It's not about the Canadian model. It's about intercultural. We accept that traditional Irish culture will change, okay, by the addition of new people, as they will change. And the benefit is for both or three or four sides. And I think this is important. And you can demonstrate this with wonderful examples in the training. You probably know, I'm sure everybody does, about river dance, Irish dancing. This became famous all over the world. Nobody in Ireland wanted to do Irish traditional dance until it became so popular. People said, is that really what we can do? And this opens a gateway for people to participate. And I think that there's no final destination here. There's a process. And when people are comfortable with that, we can make great things.
I totally agree with you, because change is natural. The nature we live in shows us that change is inevitable and it is something good. Sometimes I'm surprised when listening to young children who are obviously coming from China, from Africa and so on, speaking our Italian dialects, which are so many, and listening them talking the dialects we already know, it's something which is surprising. When we will stop being surprised by that, it means that we will be on the right direction. Anyway, thanks for your interesting inputs. I promise I will spend my summer holidays asking to myself, who am I and which is my identity. This is my personal summer homework. And thanks again for your availability to be involved in this interview, and thanks for your interesting inputs.
Thank you, Antonio.